It's taking longer than normal. Stand by, everyone. Give us a second here. Okay, we should be good. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cannabis Marketing Live. I am your host, Jake Litke. Today, we have Jenny Shi with us. Jenny is the VP of Media Strategy and Operations here at MediaGel. She's been here since July. We're very excited to have her. Today, we're going to be talking about customer lifetime value. But before we kick that off, it will become apparent as we go through the information we're going to cover that Jenny knows what she's talking about. But Jenny, maybe you could just do a quick bio on how you found yourself here.
Yeah, for sure. So, hi everyone, nice to meet you. I've been working in agency life pretty much since I graduated college, started in analytics, and then started branching into programmatic, which was my very first love in the industry. I also had the opportunity to then scale even further than that. So I've done everything from, site direct, print, CTV, digital out of home, radio, et cetera, all the way down to programmatic, paid social, paid search, ad operations, analytics. I kind of sort of got really into this idea of becoming like a general specialist. I went and worked at Brand Side for a while, big CBD company. You may have heard of it, Charlotte's Web CBD. Really loved my time there, but kind of just had that itch of, hey, I want to get way deeper into the thing that I knew that I loved, which was programmatic. And one thing led to another. Was able to find a space here in MediaGel where I'm very excited to be. I think what we're working on from a data and tech product standpoint, as well as the activation standpoint for our clients, is just a really, really fun place to be. So I'm glad to be here.
Great. Thank you.
Mhm.
All right. So customer lifetime value, CLV. We're going to be talking about that as well as a bunch of other alphabet soup acronyms here. So let's set the table because we really can't talk about any of this without throwing out a bunch of acronyms. Um, Jenny, I think you've got a slide you can bring up that has the terminology that we'll be using, and we'll walk through those first so that everyone knows what we're talking about, and then we'll get into some strategies based on campaigns and timing.
All right. Can everyone see the screen?
I think we're
All
good.
right. All right. So in terms of, I also fondly like to call this the marketing KPIs that CMOs should know. And so we have this broken out into a couple of different pillars. From a marketing effectiveness standpoint, we're going to talk about CAC, or customer acquisition cost. We have LTV or CLV. They're sort of used interchangeably, basically customer lifetime value. What is an LTV to CAC ratio? Why is it important? And then ROI. Then we've got KPIs for our live campaign optimizations. So, ROAS or CPA, so revenue over ad spend, or cost per acquisition. Cost per acquisition oftentimes is a cost per purchase, but it could be something else. It could be cost per lead, cost per newsletter subscription sign up, et cetera, cost per add to cart. We've got AOV, which is average order value. We'll go over what a correlation coefficient means and what is it useful for. And
That
then the
sounds complicated.
secondary, it's actually very easy, but there is a
Okay.
lot of like brain work that kind of goes behind defining, hey, the number that I see, what is it actually trying to tell me? Should I dig further? That kind of thing. And then the last bucket, we've got pacing, CTR. Those might be more familiar to the folks on this call here, but those are the starting KPIs that we just want to make sure we use as like health metrics of, we've launched this campaign. Are we doing okay? So these are really like the kind of like the laundry list of KPIs that I really suggest that your team start looking into, your agency partners really start to help you define. I like to see all of these data points as like ingredients. I'm a foodie, so I'm like, okay, you have all these ingredients coming in, but you have to make a decision of what do I trust? What is actually going to behoove me, right, to move forward towards and actually believe in to try to curate some sort of hypothesis around, a test around, and activate, and which ones are just good to know for now, but not a big enough data point to actually feed into the strategy.
Great. And so then we're going to take all of these acronyms and terms, and we're going to do what? We're going to walk through the kind of the life cycle of a campaign from beginning through hopefully ongoing.
Yeah. So the way that this is sort of laid out is, you know, we go out there, we launch a campaign. This is applicable to programmatic. It could honestly also be applicable to other channels that you're running in paid search, paid social. You can look at it as a whole body of work as well. So it's going to start from we start a campaign and what can you start to monitor and analyze as the campaign grows over time. And then after a couple of weeks, then what do you do? After a couple of weeks, what do you then do? So it's going to get more and more advanced as we go through this presentation.
Great.
So the first 2 weeks, really this is monitoring, right? Just health metrics, trying to understand, hey, we've set live the blueprints that we do know so far. How are we doing? So the first KPI
Before
is going, Mhm.
you go further, let's talk
Uh-huh.
about blueprints for a second because
Okay,
we've
yeah.
created we've assumed we've made a blueprint, but let's talk about how
Yes.
one crafts a blueprint.
Well, part of that is actually going to be in this deck, but
Okay,
a
I'm getting ahead of
blueprint,
it.
yeah, a blueprint to me is this, is helping to define your channel mix, your activation mix. You can also include your creative mix of what is going to help drive your business in different initiatives of acquisition, of awareness, of retention. And there are general blueprints that are going to be really good by industry. You know, we're really good at regulated industries on our end, especially in the cannabis world. But every brand is different. It can depend on the locality that you're in, the consumer base that you have, or even like how your website is built, the packaging and the branding, who is it speaking to? And so, with all of those elements combined, starting with the blueprint is always very helpful, but then finding and curating the one for your business or for your client's business is ultimately the goal.
Thank you.
You got it. So, first metric, pacing. This is just to understand, hey, we have an X amount of budget, we have an X amount of time period, and pacing is the concept of delivering impressions and planned spend in full, typically on a relatively consistent spending basis, with flexibility built in to be able to adjust where you want to spend based on performance. And so the formulas here, we've got where are we at today? So that's your ad spend divided by your planned spend. You can also do this based on impressions as well, if that's how your business is set up. So we've got delivered impressions divided by planned impressions. And then also we want to know like pacing, you've got like what is happening now, but also as a forecast, if this kept continuing the way that it is, where do we actually see ourselves by the end of that time period or that campaign flight? And so we've got ad spend divided by the number of days that have passed. I usually look up until the day of yesterday. So you have a full day of spend or impressions to add into this formula. And then times that by the total number of days in the campaign, then divide that by planned spend. So this also gives you an idea of, okay, like we think we're doing okay. However, our formulation's actually telling us that we are pacing to the end of the campaign to only spend like 85% of the budget. And so that can be a flag to say, okay, is there somewhere where we can increase scale and improve that in a smart way, of course? And where can those places be? And so on the left side over here, I just have some like thought starter questions. This is something that, you know, our teams are going through, making sure that they're monitoring through just a couple of first days, the campaigns are live. Are they delivering the impressions? And then are we pacing as expected?
Great.
The next one is CTR. So again, probably a very familiar metric. This is clicks divided by impressions. It's an indicator, I'm going to say indicator pretty strongly, of engagement and attention. It's just not a perfect metric when you think about like the bot activity that's out there and things like that, but it can provide us directional data on whether or not we are within the expected CTR range for this campaign. So the 0.05% to 0.2%, keep in mind that is programmatic. It will be different from, you know, channel to channel. Paid search is very different, search is very different. But if it's generally in the right range of where you're at, then we're starting to feel a little good. If it's, you know, spending like 100,000 impressions and it hasn't gotten a singular click, that's also an indicator if something is going on. Do we look at viewability? So it's a health metric to help us say, hey, is there another line of attack that we need to be digging into? And so the questions that we ask ourselves in the first 2 weeks. So first week, we're going, okay, just what are the initial CTRs of the campaign? Like, what do they look like? And then on an ongoing basis, and I really like to trend this out typically by creative, but we can also look at this by publisher, by deal ID, by geo, things like that. But look at it on a trended basis to say, is CTR increasing or decreasing? And then are we seeing some sort of trend down or up over time, particularly in creative? Like I've seen creatives out in the space for like, 6 months, and you start to really see that engagement tank just because it started to lose its value. People have gotten used to it. It's time to refresh and maybe put some new creative out there.
Yeah, you can also see on the creative front, you mentioned earlier, CTR, there can be a lot of noise in CTR based on the creative size, the publishers. But one thing that works pretty well is the actual different creative ad units, right? If you're A/B
Mm,
testing something and it's running on the same publishers and it's the same creative size, and you see a big difference in CTR, that's going to be an indicator that you're learning something there, which is if one creative is performing much better than the other, you want to dig into that, understand what's happening with that particular creative, and see if you can replicate or adjust your creatives that are lagging from a CTR perspective.
for sure. And then, like, as you can expect, if the size of the ad, there's like placement of the ad. So is it above the fold or below the fold? That definitely comes into play. That's a little bit of the viewability play in there as well. But then also size, depending on the size of the ad on the unit that you're looking at. I'm saying it that way because a 300 by 600 on a mobile device is much bigger than it looks like on a desktop. Whereas on desktop at 970 by 250 is going to look a lot bigger. And what captures attention can also drive that click better. And so to Jake's point too, there's also a size mix to keep in mind as well.
Yep.
So then after week two, or when there's enough data that's been gathered, and I've got a bunch of methods on how to define if you have enough data to actually make a decision. These are some of the metrics that we start looking at. So we've got that cost per acquisition, again, oftentimes attributed to some sort of purchase event. When would you maybe want to use this instead of like a revenue over ad spend goal? Because like, why wouldn't you just start with ROAS? And part of this would be like if we're working on an e-commerce brand, right? But we just place the pixel on day one, and maybe it's just either the day of the launch or a few days before the launch. It really hasn't generated that much information yet to train the algorithms. And what I've seen happen is that it can actually throttle your delivery in the platform because it's trying really hard to learn towards a higher ROAS that it's not capable of having all of the data yet to feed what it needs. And so this is where we often would start with a CPA goal first, just so that, every transaction bit can kind of be seen as one whole unit that is important to us. Have that data grow, maybe say to like 1,000 loads or something like that. And then you flip on ROAS and then allow that to run. The other side of things is like, what if you're not an e-commerce brand? Like, what if you are only a brand that has maybe a digital presence, but you really sell in store, at retail, things like that. In the case of, say, like an auto dealership or even a dispensary, maybe if you don't have online ordering or something like that, what we want to be able to do is find an action that we can track that correlates with actual walk-ins to a store or some sort of purchase in a store and things like that. And we'll go through that with the correlation coefficient, but at the starting level from a digital perspective, that might be a reason why we would also use CPA. So like a cost per lead, cost per sign up, etc. And this calculation is just ad spend divided by the volume of those conversions. And to the left side, this is all dummy data, but this is a way that I would lay out very simply. It can get more deep than this, but very simply rolled up the different tactics that you have, the amount of spend that you've had against that, and the amount of conversions that's been attributed to those tactics. After 2 weeks of being live, we just want to understand what are the initial CPAs, but then on an ongoing basis, is CPA increasing or decreasing, and which particular tactic is actually pulling that CPA up or pulling it down. And so this is also something I'll get into a little bit more, but I think it's really important to say, hey, if I just looked at this, right? We've got tactic 3, that's got the best CPA. Tactic 2, ooh, that's a pretty high CPA. Tactic 1's sort of in the middle. If I didn't think about the cost itself and just the CPAs, I would say, hey, what could I do in tactic 1 and tactic 2 to bring that down? But once you bring in the cost volume in as a column, you can actually see, well, tactic one hasn't spent as much as the rest. In fact, tactic two is probably was really driving up the CPA. And so maybe that's actually the one I want to hone in on. And let's let tactic one ride a little bit. Let it kind of just see if it actually gets better over time before we go, ooh, that's a bad one.
Yeah, and so let's talk about time. I know that volume of data is going to be key here, right? So if
Mm.
you're spending small dollars, you don't really have a large data volume. You're not giving the algorithms and the operations team time to make adjustments. So yeah, are you going to cover that later in terms of how to think about volume?
Yeah, I'll just skip to it.
Okay.
That's a great question. I love that question. I've obviously thought about this a lot. I've worked with like companies like General Mills, right? Huge budgets. Then I've worked with companies that are just barely starting out, so they're like spending $500 to $1,000 a month. And so it gets really, interesting when we talk about how do we want to approach the time basis of then defining when can we actually make decisions. So I'll start with method one, which is just based on what is out in the market, how many impressions does it take for your campaign or your tactic or whatever to drive the conversion that you're looking for? So let's say purchase. If it's 2,000 impressions for that data cut, then in order to evaluate that data cut to determine whether or not it's something we need to optimize, it must at least hit 2,000 impressions. So that's like one method. There's a little bit of art in that as well because it's like if you have more than 2,000 impressions, but you only have, say, one conversion load, maybe all it takes is three more conversions to come in the next 2 weeks to really balance it out. So that's where the art comes in a little bit for somebody who is directing the media to say, hey, do I feel comfortable just letting this ride another week or do I not? Method two is taking into account what I'm going to call reliable statistical significance. I say reliable because programmatic impressions, they increase incredibly fast. There's just a lot of inventory out there. So if you go on Google and you find one of these calculators and you put in your impression load, and maybe it's just 2,000, right, in your denominator, it could tell you that you have a 99, 95, whatever percent stat sig, but the reality is, you just put like another couple $100 into programmatic, that's going to scale really fast, the denominator. And so it's not what I say sticky in terms of a metric necessarily. And so I had an opportunity to work with a really, really smart data lead who helped me come to this number, which was if we want to have like a sticky stat sig number, try to make sure that the data cut you're evaluating has a minimum of 200 to 250,000 impressions. So by data cut, I mean just some like form of data set that you're looking at. Are we looking at creative performance? That's one data cut. Are we looking at publisher performance? That's one data cut. Do we want to go deeper and say creatives that ran specifically on this placement, right? The creatives are the data cut. But the problem with this one, of course, is not every business is going to be able to just spend that much per creative to then make a decision on it. So that takes me to method three, where I'm going to call this the with or without method. So kind of talking about that CPA thing we just talked about of like, hey, which line is actually having most impact on pulling the CPA up or down. The idea here is if I actually just removed that line from the data set completely, how much does the CPA or ROAS shift? To try to understand how much contribution did that line item have to the total performance? Did it contribute it in a positive way, as in it made it better? Did it contribute in a negative way, as in it made it worse? Or did it not spend enough that it literally doesn't even matter? And if it didn't spend enough, it's not to say that, you know, it's something that has to be cut or changed because realistically, in a marketing funnel, you kind of do want to find people that are harder to convert, right? To add to your total customer base, truly acquisition. They should be more expensive to convert. But you also want to balance that out with the folks that are shopping, that are a little bit more primed to convert and acquire them as well. That is really what you kind of actually want to aim to get to. So just because one line item has, a lower ROAS or higher CPA, if it's not spending enough to make a huge impact on your total business and your total mix, leave it in. And so that's
Yeah.
what we typically rely on the most because this method can be applied across all small and all large campaigns.
So two things. One is for the non-data nerds, stat sig means statistically significant, right? Meaning that you have enough data to actually come to an informed decision. And then another would be, Jenny, maybe you could give a real world example. You don't have to name names or anything, where something happened that you're talking about, where like you had a line item that like how would someone like give it like an exact example of, okay, here's a line item. How do I look at that and say this is not relevant or it is? Do I just remove it temporarily to see what
Mhm.
happens? Do I change the volume? Like, how would you approach that?
I would say actually the easy example here would actually say, hey, if I'm in programmatic, right, and I wanted to test an entirely new partner, say I want to test a private marketplace deal with Condé Nast on the Vogue publication, and this is just a totally new test. I want to see if this audience is going to work well for us. That would be a new placement that we add into the mix. So with or without method is something that we can then apply to determine, is this a positive test to continue to scale into? Or do we actually learn from this test that in fact, this is not the audience for us and pull out? That's probably like the most simple way that I can define it. But also, most of the time, the way that we look at this information, it's going to be both macro and micro, so macro tests and micro details, because it's really trying to nominally find additional efficiencies so that in the end, your overall ROAS and your lift in revenue looks better. So it's not typically a huge ringer. It's a
Yeah.
constant, if you think of us humans taking a little bit of the art into the science and making us the robot, like this is what this is kind of doing, is it is continually getting better.
And what would you classify in the macro bucket versus the micro bucket when you're thinking about indicators?
Oh, I mean, I could go real macro. Some of the macro ones that I'm thinking of actually just my macro in my world is something like carving out a particular test. Maybe it's carving out a digital out of home test in Chicago, and we're also then retargeting the device IDs that have walked by them. Maybe we've never done that before. That's a macro test. Maybe it's we're working with a new influencer and we're trying to do a co-marketing campaign, and maybe we've never done that before for this brand. That would be a big test. Maybe it's launching a new store, a new dispensary in Ohio. That could be a big test. So for me, macro really just means a test project, something that also requires a lot more strategic input before the launch, but could also include a lot of these cooler units that maybe you haven't tried before. We also have CTV, we've got streaming radio, right? So these are all more macro. And then micro would be like maybe it's a new creative suite within the existing campaign.
Okay. Or like a different audience.
Different audience or a specific new like audience element. Not even like a whole new persona, but maybe we're testing a new provider. Someone maybe that has come out with more innovative technology on how they are, curating their audiences and then sending them to us to be able to activate on.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mhm. I'm going to back it up one slide just in case anyone wanted to
Okay.
see this. So ROAS, this is a typical revenue-based KPI to optimize digital campaigns against average order value. Really, I use this as a secondary metric only because ROAS doesn't always mean that the program itself is set up in a poor way. Sometimes the SKU mix is changing. Did we run a different promo that's been pushing the gummies product that's cheaper than like the flower product, right? And so if we can understand AOV and have that information passed back through the pixel to the DSP, to our programmatic platforms, we can start to understand those types of things to then say, okay, maybe it's not actually that we need to change tactic, two or whatever. Maybe it's that we need to provide a strategic recommendation of, hey, let's augment the merchandising a bit in maybe the ad creative, or maybe let's actually even lean into it further and try to upsell these particular folks. Maybe we know that the gummies are a sticky product. You trial them, you want to buy something else. So how do we then try to upsell them to get them to buy something that we can even say, oh, these are the favorites of our bud tenders. Like it's been verified that they love it and get them to buy a higher value product.
Great.
The questions are basically the same at this point, right? On an ongoing basis, is it increasing or decreasing and why? So after all of this, these are some of the more macro-ish metrics. I think something that are also really important for marketing teams to be looking into. So this is the correlation coefficient that we were talking about. It looks like a lot of text, but I promise you it's not that complicated. The idea here is to determine that, hey, if you're spending this money, is it really money in and money out, right? Is there a correlation to the program spend that you have to then the revenue that you're seeing? This can be helpful also, again, like if you only have offline metrics, to find digital metrics and find your offline metrics of like your in-store sales or whatnot, and you compare them to then see if those are correlative to help you define an online metric as your CPA KPI. And so the way that this works is if you look over to the right, I typically for like a revenue-based thing, I'll break it out by month. So you have cost in one column, you have revenue in the other column. I do this in Excel because I'm an Excel girly. So the formula in Excel is equal coral. And then you basically just copy the full length of column one, comma, and then you copy the full length of column two, and it will result in a number between -1 to 1. Basically, -1 is an inverse relationship. So one number goes up, the other number goes down. As an example, CPA. When spend goes up, you kind of actually would love CPA to go down. So that is actually a positive relationship you would want to see for inverse. Then 1 is a very positive correlation, meaning that one measure goes up and the other one does. In this case, you would want cost and revenue to line up pretty well, right? And so how to read the results is typically a correlation between 0.7 to 1 is considered strong. A correlation between -0.7 to -1 then is considered a strong inverse correlation. Between zero point 0.4 to zero point 0.7, and then also the negative versions of that, those are considered relatively strong correlations. And I'll also say that oftentimes this is where we are at, only because you kind of want a marketing funnel to work the way it's supposed to, right? Like you want to have some awareness and prospecting, lower funnel and then retention, and they all work together. So some people up here might take like 2 months or 3 months to actually buy something. So you don't actually want it to be a perfect correlation of one number going up and one going down, but you want it to have a relatively strong one. The closer it gets to 0, there's just basically the weaker the correlation. It's just a free for all, right? Like doesn't matter where you put the money, revenues kind of go like this. Um, and to the point that I was just saying, this is a watch out that I've seen before where we had a really, really strong correlation. So I would just say if you see a number that's like 0.8 to 1 and you have a really high ROAS, this is not an indicator that something wrong is happening, but it is an indicator to go look at it. Don't look at this as being, oh my God, we're doing an amazing job, because that is actually indicating money in, money out in the exact same month. And that is a marketing funnel issue, because there then is the risk that if you pull the money out in month 2, you're not going to see that revenue impact continue to hold that strongly. And so where you would go with this is to then actually take a look at your new customer acquisition volume data on a trended table and compare that also to your retained customer volume as well, both number of customers and also revenue of customers, just to try to get a good understanding of whether or not the program that has this high correlation is actually also driving new customer acquisition purchases, or is it just hitting your loyalty base?
Yeah, let's dig in on that a little bit more. What
Mhm.
are some factors that could be happening underneath those numbers, or some common things that could be occurring where you've got this really high correlation number and you're like, oh, look, this is great, but what's happening that you should look into potentially?
Yeah, so like as an example, right? I keep hearing this in the space, and this is kind of a recent thing, which I think is just so interesting. But so many agencies are being tasked to drive like 10 ROAS, like a $10 ROAS, 10x. And I look at that and I'm like, okay, you want me to make your number look really pretty? I can make it look pretty. But what is it doing? It's training the algorithm to look for people who are very primed to convert. It's trying to make it the most efficient person to then bid on. And there's so much we can do in terms of excluding customer lists and things like that. However, data is not perfect, right? It has to match, 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 and then match again. So what happens is, I've seen this before where I've worked in platforms where they claim they're excluding our customers. But then when we actually dug into the data, the order IDs they were attributing back to themselves to hit that 10 ROAS were actually customers that we had had for a long time. They had purchased with us, 4, 5, 6, 7 times. And that is the nature of what we're trying to get the algorithm and forcing the algorithm to do. And so what happens is then you're actually spending all of that money on your very loyal base. Did you need to spend that much money? There probably is some of them that could benefit from seeing your promotions faster to buy faster, because I have seen that as well. But don't spend all of it on them, or at least know that you are. And I think that is the issue is like, again, so many people are asking now for $10 ROASs, and you have to ask yourselves, is that the only number that I should be showcasing to my CFO, or should I be trying to go after incrementality and growth?
Yep, that makes sense. What are some ways that you would adjust if that was a scenario that was happening where you've done a very good job of sort of unintentionally spending more of your budget on retention? You should definitely spend some of your budget on retention, but we want new customers as
Mhm.
well. How would you dig into that and course correct a little bit? Obviously, there's a conversation that you would have at that point. The marketer would need to understand, like, okay, your ROAS numbers, you're spending too much of your money on retention. So we need to dial that back, but by how much? And
Mm.
what tactics do you do to resolve that?
Yeah, so I'm definitely like a data person. So I typically start by first looking at some metrics because I want to understand if there's a story around what I'm seeing. Is there a why? Because I now know the what, right? The what is high correlation, high ROAS, and now maybe I see the retained customer piece is like actually really strong in there. So then like how do I move forward? So I'm going to go through a couple of more KPIs here because I think that they're important into the
Mhm.
ingredients into the soup. One of which is that customer acquisition cost. So basically, customer acquisition cost is ad spend divided by the number of your first-time buyers. Um, I like to see this on a shifted trended scale on top of that trended data set of new acquisitions and customers. Because I've also seen the flip side, right? Where when you exclude all of your retention base, I've seen CAC get better, acquisitions get better, but then actually the total revenue doesn't actually have that lift because, like Jake said, it's still important to have that retention base hold as a solid foundation and have that incrementally grow. And we'll talk about ways that you can grow the LTV of that base while you're adding customers on top. Because otherwise, if you're just having other customers that are loyal churn out while you're adding on top, you're just kind of filling a leaky bucket with new people, right? Versus really plugging the holes and growing up. So CAC is one metric that I look at because I want to understand where are we at right now. We'll talk about how we define a good CAC metric in a little bit. The other thing that I like to do is, typically I look at these things by month because then it gives it a whole month of data to really have an impact. So I also then will make a trended chart of what was the channel mix for each of these months. Because when you start to line all of them together, these charts and these charts, you can start to visually understand, okay, when I did this, it helped drive new acquisitions. When I did this, it helped drive retained customers. When I did a combination of this, then it actually did both. And this is actually how you can start to find the blueprints for you or your clients to be able to get to their specific blueprint. And this can take a while, right? Because then you have to add in things like seasonality, right? 420, and it's big. Everybody is probably going after the same types of promos. Bring them all in, buy our weed. Q4 is coming up. It's very expensive, right? To be playing in that space, but you got to be there. And so you then have to lay all of this out to kind of start to define. So again, this is one of those things that just gets incrementally better over time. Then we've got
Yep.
LTV. Oh, This is a big topic. Do you have a
Oh,
question
I
before I
was
get
going to
into
say something
this?
about holidays and
Oh,
Q4.
yeah.
Um, I think one of the things that, especially on the cannabis side, people tend to forget is that the positive side of the ability to operate in the programmatic environment is you have access to the all the inventory that everyone has access to. The downside is that you're now playing in a different environment, right? You're not on an endemic publisher or you're not on weed maps. You're playing, you have a table, you have a seat at the table, but so does everyone else. So you are bidding against Coca-Cola and Taco Bell and Home Depot. When it comes to traditional holidays, you will see the media cost goes up, right? Because
Mm.
ultimately we're bidding on impressions. And when large companies are activating their Q4 holiday budgets, that's going to increase the price of media. And then you need to understand that is going to have an impact on your ROAS.
There's also another element in there too, is because holiday is such a big time period, a lot of these larger advertisers, say like a General Mills, they're going direct to that publisher and buying up inventory. So also the inventory that gets to programmatic, it does kind of it is sort of one of those games where it's not like a definite every year that we can like forecast how much it is, but you just have to keep in mind not only is the demand going up in programmatic, but the supply also has an opportunity to go down. So then when they
Right? Because
compound each
people
other,
pre-buy.
exactly, CPMs go up.
Yeah. It's a supply demand formula.
That's why I love this world, right? It's like, I mean, it is kind of like I feel like sometimes I'm trading stocks, but n I'm not.
It's the same mechanics though. Ultimately, you have
It
buyers and
is.
sellers, you have bid and ask.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's the way I explain it to a lot of people that have never heard of programmatic. That's where I start with because
Yeah.
people understand, at least conceptually, how the stock market works.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, getting into the big stuff. LTV, customer lifetime value. So this is an indicator of how much total value to expect from a customer segment. Also, this is what can help us define what is going to be a sustainable CAC goal for your business. Now, I'm a pretty literal person sometimes, so I will say, like, for a lot of like my earlier years, I just kind of thought, oh, customer lifetime value. It had to be like the full lifetime of one customer. Like me, Jenny, if I go out and I buy something from, I don't know, Sephora, and I'm not on a subscription model, and I just kind of buy all these a la carte one-offs, that's really hard to measure. If I was in the financial sector, right, selling loans that had a specific amount of year block against that, that's a little bit easier, of course, to define what that LTV looks like. So I went, okay, let me just think this through a little bit. How is this actually going to be impactful for our business and our clients? And oftentimes, especially if you have like an e-commerce functionality or things like that, our clients and our businesses, we have to approve and reevaluate budgets and goals on a quarterly and or annual basis. So taking lifetime out of it, right? It's more so the lifetime value of the time period that matters. And so what I would say is like build an LTV cycle on an annual basis, and then you can also update what that looks like on a quarterly basis. Then what we want to do is define buy rate tiers. This is just a fancy word for LTV. It's just a word that large retailers like a Walmart or a Target know, and actually they'll package up and ship off to their brand product partners that have products on their shelves. And so we're just switching up the nomenclature just a little bit so that it's in the same jargon that these large companies and retailers are also familiar with. So buy rate is how much a customer buys and the frequency at which they buy. So this will take into account if, say, me, I go to, a website, I spend a lot of money, but I actually don't buy that often. And say I spend $500 in that same quarter. And then Jake, you go to that same site and you're like, I actually like buying little things, but I buy it a lot. And so you end up spending 500 as well. Jake and I will be in the same buy rate tier. Then the next step is to break them out into further sub tiers. So now you would be able to define, okay, me, I am an infrequent buyer, but I am high AOV. Jake, he is a frequent buyer and he is a low AOV. And then you keep breaking those out. So between high or low AOV and if they are frequent or infrequent, because once you are able to break all of those out, you can now define specific promo messaging against them to get their own buy rate or LTV up.
And
So, oh, yes?
go ahead. No, go ahead.
No,
You're
go
still
for it.
going.
Oh,
Well, I was gonna
let,
say, how do you do that?
oh, well, let me tell you. The goal here, right, is to get people to move into other buy rates and get them further and further and more loyal. So say you're super loyal, you're a high purchase value, you spend a lot of money, you're super frequent. We want to give you exclusive offers. Maybe we'll let you know about exclusive drops of new products that are coming on our shelves. You get an exclusive offer on your birthday or something like that. Something to say, hey, thank you. We see you. You are loyal. We're going to give back to you as well. Please stay with us. Continue to be loyal. For those who are infrequent, what we're trying to get them to do is just be a little bit more frequent. So how do we build a promo around them to drive that repurchase? Maybe you notice that they tend to buy the same product or kind of product pretty frequently. Maybe build a promo specifically around that. That's, also a really decent promo that's going to get them to want to buy it, right? And just get them to come back and get them into that cycle of being back more frequently. Maybe for those that are infrequent, low AOV, they're really not that loyal. Maybe they tried out a product and they were like, "Ooh, that didn't do anything for me." Maybe they didn't feel it, maybe whatever, right? They were just not that loyal. Maybe this again, take that staff pick mentality. I mean, especially in the cannabis world, right? You find that good bud tender, you want to stick with them because they're really helping you. They're really knowledgeable about their products. And so maybe here we go, okay, let's pick what the sticky product is that really retains customers well. And let's give them a promo and be like, hey, this is our bud tender's favorite for this week. Like, we saw that you tried this one. This is a better version of that we really, really, really like. Here's a promo on it. And try to get them to buy again, just try again. Because really, someone who's only bought one time, they're a customer, right? They're not loyal to us yet. There's some work we need to do to retain them. And then finally, for those who have a low AOV but are frequent customers like Jake in this example, we just want them to increase their cart value. And there could be different ways to kind of run this idea, right? Maybe to increase their cart value, it's like, oh, it's a buy two, get one free or something like that, just to try to get them to have a higher AOV. So the goal here is really, again, to get them to move to a different buy rate tier.
Fair enough. By the way, I am a high AOV, low frequency shopper because
Ah,
I fit the stereotype of no one in my extended family seems to want to go to dispensaries, so I am the designated shopper. So infrequent but large purchases.
that's funny. I am almost exclusively an edibles person. So, I am a high AOV because I buy many of them at once. And I also am ending up as an infrequent buyer because I just bulk buy.
There you go.
All right. So LTV to CAC ratio. This is how you can help define what your CAC should look like. So the goal here is to define a CAC goal that is big enough to allow your campaigns to scale, and so you can move up the funnel, while also maintaining a sustainable program through leveraging an LTV to CAC ratio. So take the segments out of your head right now. Right now, we're just going to do overall average value per customer in that time period that we're looking at. So for a quarterly LTV, we're going to, just as an example, we'll just take Q1 total customer revenue divided by the total number of customers, and then also do that at the annual level as well. And then you can define what your CAC goal looks like using this ratio. Basically, for startups, a 3-to-1 ratio is a really great place to start. This simply means that you want to maintain an LTV that is 3 times the value of CAC. And so knowing your average LTV above, you are able to then do this calculation. So like if your annual LTV is $300, then your CAC goal would be $100. CAC is something you can measure on a monthly basis over time. I would say redefine your CAC goals perhaps on that quarterly basis so you have enough data to actually look at. But that gives you this ability to then readjust what your goals are and your objectives are on a quarterly basis. Now, going back to your other question of like, how do you define how much money to spend where? I mean, the hard answer really is like that's part of the art, science, and testing. I don't have a one-stop shop for every single advertiser. It really has to do with where you are, what is your setup. I mean, first of all, like, can you even get to your LTV? Like, we have to first start by calculating what that even looks like, right? Do you have a bunch of customers that are churning out? How important is it to retain your customers? How often are they coming back? We also have really great reports that allow us to tap into, like, say you're a dispensary, right? You're a location. We can understand visitation as well. You know, are people frequently coming back to your dispensary or are they not coming back frequently? And if we understand how well retention is doing, then we can understand how much can we take from the budget that we have to then grow on top. But I would say solidify the base, but just caution that if you have a $10 ROAS on that base, define if you really need to spend that much. Start pulling out increments of that budget and see if the revenue holds.
Yeah. And that's an important factor to think about. I think that unfortunately, the way that marketing services are structured, there's a tendency for people to recommend spending as much as they can, right?
Mhm.
Because ultimately, most marketing companies, that's how they make money, is on marketing spend. We like to take a more nuanced approach. Ultimately, your marketing partners should be looking at these data points and understanding where your saturation level is on any given particular campaign tactic. And while we do a lot of programmatic. Programmatic really should be one part of your overall marketing strategy, and it should be supporting your email, your texting, your loyalty, and all those things. And you should be getting this kind of data because sometimes you're right. It's like, okay, you don't need to spend $10,000 here. You can spend $5,000 and get a better return on the $5,000 because you're hitting sort of a law of diminishing returns with the extra budget. That frees up your budget, your overall marketing budget to invest in other areas where that $5,000 could be, providing a better return.
Yeah, definitely. And there's also some like larger level objectives as well. Now, I'm going to plus out of just cannabis here, just based on the experiences I've had. But say you're a startup company, maybe you're a tech startup, right? And your goal is to ultimately, one, you get all this funding, right? You're going through all the Series A, B, whatever. And then what you want to do is maybe you eventually want to be able to sell. So what are the metrics maybe that are most important to you at that time? Maybe somebody comes to me and says, hey, the metric that I actually care about right now is revenue, not ROI. I just need revenue to grow crazy fast, and it's okay if it's not breaking even. That is a very different type of tactic then for us to then build a strategy around. And so there's this level of business health and where it's at, which is what we're looking at right now, like the campaign health and where do we invest. But of course, there's going to be these larger objectives that will help define as well of is this going to be as important for the main objective that maybe C-suite is worried about or that the board of directors is worried about.
Yep, that makes sense. Did we make it through all of your slides? Oh no, we've
There's
got a
one last one, but
couple
this is
more.
like a pretty
Okay.
generic one that I think most CMOs and marketers are going to know. I just like to throw it in here because, again, the deck is called metrics that KPI, marketing KPIs that CMO should know. So this is just gross revenue minus discounts minus COGS divided by your marketing cost. This is really good as an overall metric to look at. It's super helpful to try to understand, hey, as a marketing function and cohort, is there room to say increase your discounts and your promos and your ads to really, go after certain buy rate tier, sub tiers, or going after certain, lower funnel folks and really just try to acquire that sale? Is there room for COGS, more tools, something that can help you segment out those users in a better way and actually be able to target those users in the way that we strategically want to do? Or this is the sadder side, but it's true. It's like, do we need to cut costs? This is a good formula to help you define that. Okay, now
Yeah,
again.
and that's a common thing you see. People think that a lot of times ROI and ROAS are the same thing,
Right.
right? And this is a good formula down here, right? So
Hmm.
ROAS is a very specific thing. It's how many dollars were generated based on your ad spend. But if you are offering a heavy discount, if you spent a whole bunch of money making the creative, like maybe you filmed a Super Bowl ad style thing, those things should be taken into account, right? So, okay,
Hmm.
if you take just a naive ROAS of, oh, it's great, it's 10x. Okay, but how much did you spend on the creative, how much you're offering for discounts. Those things all need to be subtracted out to get to your true ROI. And understanding your true ROI is going to be what you need for the distance.
And they are, I don't know if this is like the right word, but it's the word I'll use. They are hard metrics, meaning like they are solid metrics. They are trackable metrics. Because even when we talk about CPA and ROAS, it's all on the basis of what is able to be measured in the digital landscape. And not everything can be measured and not everything can be attributed. And so when you're looking at ROAS, realistically, actually, your real ROAS is probably higher than what you can even see, higher than what we can even report.
Yeah.
And that is just the nature of how marketing works. I mean, me as a consumer, I'm not actually linearly going through the ads the way that we have it segmented out. I'm listening to my friends, right? I'm hearing somebody talk about it in my local coffee shop, something like
Seeing a
that.
billboard.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
then I go and buy something. Maybe I walk into the store and I buy it, and all of a sudden I'm now on like Target's radar of their buy rate segment. But maybe the digital campaign that hit me will never know that I went and bought that product. And so ROI is really important for this too, because those are the measures you know for certain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. We have a few minutes left here. For those of you in Zoom directly, there's a Q&A section. You can ask some questions. We'll answer them live. If you're on YouTube or LinkedIn, feel free to post a question there and we'll follow up. Also, if you're interested in seeing the deck that Jenny put together, you can reach out to either her or I directly. I'm Jake at MediaGel. She's Jenny at MediaGel. LinkedIn also works. So we'll see if we get any questions via Zoom. I wanted to take the remaining time that we had and, talk through some anonymized real world scenarios that you've seen that are memorable, where you got an interesting piece of data. And there's, oh, actually, right before that, let's talk about failed, in quotes, campaigns,
Yeah.
right? This is going to happen. You're going to run a campaign and it's not going to perform the way that you want. And there can be a lot of reasons. The most common ones are going to be either something wrong with the creative itself. It's not connecting with the consumer. A lot of times you've got a post-click user experience, like the landing page you're sending them to is not optimized. We're not going to dive into that. That's a whole separate topic, but I have seen campaigns that were fundamentally advertising the exact same product with a different name, going to two different landing pages because they were different companies, and one of them has a 10x ROAS and one of them has a 1x ROAS, right? But circling back, I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot, but if you think of some anecdotal stories to tell, um, what do you got?
So it's interesting because thinking about this more, and I think this is just how my brain is wired. If I test something, the goal, of course, the ultimate goal is to win, right? But the goal really is to learn something. So if I learned that this tactic is the wrong tactic to go towards, and I learned that this other tactic is the right tactic to go towards, I've learned something. Or even if I learned that this is not the right tactic to lean into and lean out of it, again, I've learned something. I now have an update to my blueprint that this is not something that we should be running for this objective. And truly, I think the failures I've seen are not actually necessarily in the campaign itself, it's the failure to pivot. You see a data point like high ROAS and most of it's loyalty based, but you don't change what you're doing. That's really where I see failures happen because then over time, the money that is going out into the market, if you're not seeing a lift in your revenue in that annual piece, well, then now you have to go to your board of directors to report that. Or hey, say maybe if you're a company that is not in the non-regulated space or your IPO, now you have to go to your investors and explain that. And that is where I would say the word failure kind of resonates with me for this. I don't think I can tell you specific examples because oftentimes, I'm a pretty hard-headed person. Oftentimes, I can get things to pivot eventually the way that it needs to go. But yeah, sure, there have been experiences where I've had where it's just very hard line that, hey, no, we're just going to continue to do this thing. And it's incredibly hard to then crawl out of that hole if you are having a deep revenue and ROI problem. Because now, if you have this problem that you might think you know how to solve, but it includes needing more money, but now you've been in the hole too long, you now have a self-fulfilling cycle that's really hard to then re-engage.
Yeah, I suppose that's a difficult conversation to say to your CFO or executive, where you're like, okay, well, this campaign, it's delivering great ROAS, but
Hmm.
underneath that, the actual spend versus lift is not the formula that we want. We need to change our tactics, but doing that is going to reduce ROAS.
Hmm.
You need to be prepared on the other side to say, well, but don't look at this metric because it's deceiving you. Look at this other metric,
Hmm.
right? And this is where we're going to focus on. That does require some, education and convincing, I suppose.
Honestly, and I've had many people fight me on this, and that is okay. I personally, if I wanted, say I had an ideal scenario, but maybe not a lot of money, but enough money. Let's say it's like, $25,000, $30,000 per month of a budget that I can do more full funnel stuff on. I personally would go closer to like a $2 ROAS because you want it to actually be more expensive so that you're acquiring people that might not have bought before. And then you continue to pull them into your funnel, convert them, make them more loyal. And that is like the ideal ultimate cycle. So I actually really prefer more like that, like your mid funnel to like upper mid funnel, which we can get into maybe in a later session of like why I kind of define them more incrementally. But I would actually see more like a 50-cent ROAS on stuff like that because again, you want to find people that we're not going to just buy anyways.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Hmm.
All right, we've got one question here,
I actually see
which
two.
is there's two. Yep. One, there's a question that is about look back data.
Yes.
So being able to target consumers that have been in dispensaries, which is a tactic that we use today and have for a long time. It's actually the way we started before we had our revenue tracking many, 5, 6 years ago. Um, so we do have that. I will follow up with you, Susan, though, on your second question. And then we have another question, which is, and this is a higher level question
Mm.
about sort of what strategies you would take to mitigate potentially negative news, which we have a lot of in the cannabis industry, right? So this happens pretty frequently. Something happened sometimes is with a bad product or some testing that went bad or a store closing or something like that. That's a very different tactic than just, here's our product, here's our offering. Now we're not talking about products, we're talking about really brand identity for the business itself. It's kind of a somewhat open-ended question, but I'd love to hear your take on it.
Yeah, I am interested in if the direction we're taking is going to answer the if we have this right. But the way my brain was moving just now was um, I pride myself on being a fixer. Like that's what excites me, right? It's not great because that means something kind of needs to be broken. But when there's a leaky bucket situation kind of happening, maybe it's something with the website, something with the product. Maybe it's, there was like an example where I went to a website and they had a bunch of the 5 stars for reviews on there, but they didn't ha load all of their reviews. And so it actually looked like they had 0 stars. Stuff like that, right? Is putting on my like Sherlock Holmes hat and going deep into each facet of what I can find to present a recommendation, even if that means there needs to be a phased out approach to implement fixes to ultimately be able to help them. Fixing a leaky bucket is incredibly important because if we are sending a ton of traffic, qualified or test traffic that might not be qualified to the site, if it's hard to purchase the product, if it's hard to understand what you're selling, if it's hard to trust what you're selling, that's a huge deal too, because I mean, there's so many cannabis and CBD brands and all of these things out there. You're competing against all of the ones that are out there. If you don't have that much brand equity, then they might just go to another competitor. So these are all the items
Yep.
that you need to fix before you have that happen or fix in parallel. Um, my other thought was, I don't know if you meant like the ROAS conversation internally for
Oh
negative
no,
news.
I think no, I think the question is actually more of a PR question
Yeah.
about a brand or a retailer having a negative
Ooh.
news cycle.
Yeah.
And I think what we'll do on that is we'll schedule another conversation. We have some PR people in our
I was
network
gonna
that we
say,
can bring
yeah, we
on
need a
to talk
PR
about
expert in
that.
this.
It's not
Yeah.
really a CLV or LTV question, and we
Mhm.
are out of time now. Um, but if
I also
you,
would say I've always leaned on my PR experts for that.
yeah,
I know what I'm good at. I know what I'm not good at.
we'll schedule one of those. I have someone in mind to have that conversation with.
Cool.
So whoever was asking that, just stay subscribed to our newsletter and stand by for a PR related uh, webinar, and we can discuss that in more detail. Well, Jenny, thank you for your time and your masterclass. As I mentioned earlier, you know how to find us. Please reach out directly if you have follow-up questions or if you want to get some of those formulas to yourself directly. Again, this is Jake Litke. I'm the CEO. This has been another episode of Cannabis Marketing Live with Jenny Shi. Thank you so much for your time and have a great weekend, everyone. Cheers.